The Gospels say that the night before he died, Jesus gathered his followers together and ate the traditional Passover dinner. What do you think that Last Supper was like?
I think it was a rather stressful meal, men and women, and then Jesus made this extraordinary announcement. This is my body and this is my blood.
And he also says, I'm not going to drink wine again until I drink it in the kingdom. He's still expecting it to come, maybe that night. The night of Passover would be a good night for the Messiah to show up and the kingdom of God to show up.
Today, the Last Supper is reenacted in a church ritual called the Eucharist, and Jesus' words, as they appear in the Gospels, are often interpreted as his prediction that he would die, and that his death would be a sacrifice, so that the sins of each of us would be forgiven. Scholars say this is probably not what it meant to Jesus.
The idea of the forgiveness of sins for Jews is a much, much bigger thing. Forgiveness of sins meant that God would finally release Israel from the sins which had caused all this trouble. So forgiveness of sins had to do with release from their political and theological slavery. What he is quite clearly saying at the supper is, Israel's history is reaching its all-important dramatic climax. It is focused on me and my work. Israel's history's climax will involve my suffering and death very soon.
Historians differ about what happened at the Last Supper. Some people think the whole speech about his body and blood at that meal was added by the Gospel writers.
It doesn't happen in the Gospel of John, for example. And you wonder, why on earth does this not happen in John? Did he forget it, as it were? And if it was so important, how can he leave it out?
Whatever happened at the Last Supper, it does seem logical that under the circumstances, Jesus would have understood that he was in danger. After the meal, the Gospels say that Jesus and his disciples left the city and headed toward the Mount of Olives, across the Kidron Valley.
Now, the Kidron Valley has one most obvious characteristic. It's a huge graveyard. Now, a little bit off the picture to the left is the tomb of the B'nai Hazir.
Father O'Connor gives a lecture to Catholic seminary students about what he believes happened to Jesus in the Kidron Valley that night.
And this is a tomb which is called the tomb of the Pharaoh's daughter. So that even in the first century, when Jesus walked up through the Kidron Valley, he was in fact walking through a huge, well-known graveyard. Seeing those great tombs in the moonlight, it suddenly hit him. It might be tonight. I might die tonight. I might die now.
The Gospels tell us that the men climbed up the other side of the valley and stopped in a place on the Mount of Olives called Gethsemane. Here under the olive trees, the Gospels say that Jesus fell on the ground and began to pray. Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me.
The whole instinct of self-preservation took over. The oldest level of the story, which is found in Mark, says, Jesus and his disciples came to a place called Gethsemane. There he began to be deeply shocked and appalled. They depict a person on the edge of a complete breakdown, psychic and physical, through fear. The personality is coming apart under terror.
Yeah, that's straight ahead.
Here in the Garden of Gethsemane, Father O'Connor thinks he sees evidence that Jesus could have escaped if he had wanted to.
Originally, this was a very ancient staircase, you see, and this is the easiest spot to climb the Mount of Olives. Even today, you have 3 roads going up to the top from this point.
So if he was in the Garden of Gethsemane and the authorities in some fashion were coming across the valley to get him, he could have escaped?
Oh yeah, all he had to do was stay ahead of them. 10 minutes would have brought him to the top of the Mount of Olives. Another 20 minutes fast walking along the ridge would have brought him to Bethany. There he would have picked up food and water, and then off into the desert. They'd never have found him.
Today, Gethsemane is a sanctuary. Inside, there's a beautiful old grove of olive trees with roots that go back to the time when Jesus lived.
We had to protect the trees because the devout pilgrims would strip them of all their olive branches.
Father Edward Dillon from Lynbrook, New York, was in charge of the church when we were there, where the Gospels say a detachment of armed men finally caught up with Jesus.
They could have seen down from the hill here that there were men coming with torches and swords and clubs. So they saw them going. And so I believe that Jesus said, come on, let's go. And he walked right into it. Went down, in fact, to meet them. We go this way.
Okay. And down the hill is a cave where Father Dillon says they arrested Jesus. Today, there's a chapel inside.
So he said, whom are you looking for? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And he said, I am. And his disciples all fled, leaving him, as it were, flat. They were scared to death, you know. That's what happened.
All the Gospels say that one of his disciples, a man named Judas, led the guards to Jesus. In 3 of the Gospels, Judas identifies Jesus by kissing him.
Probably a fiction, because Judas looks to many of us like the representation of Judaism or the Jews as responsible for his death. If it is a fiction, it was one of the most cruel fictions that was ever invented.
Do you believe that this was written into the Gospels in order to portray the Jews as having participated in his death?
Yes.
This is why you just call it such a cruel fiction.
Yes. Well, it's because of the untold hostility that has persisted between Christians and Jews all down through the centuries.
The story of Judas is terribly controversial. Was it simply made up as a story? Some scholars think it was made up in order to be anti-Semitic, that Judas was sort of the typical quintessential Jew.
Because Judas meant Jew.
Yes. The trouble is, of course, that that was not the way people in the first century would have heard it, because that was an ordinary name. There's a lot of evidence that somebody, I'm deliberately putting this very vaguely, somebody close to Jesus betrayed him.
There's an intense debate about whether Jesus was put on trial by Jewish priests, as the Gospels indicate.
In Mark, we have 2 Jewish trials, one at night and one first thing in the morning, and we have the same thing in Matthew. In Luke, we have only 1 Jewish trial, just in the morning. In John, we have no Jewish trial at all. Okay, so we don't have any clear evidence about Jewish trials per se.
Some people argue the trial couldn't have happened because the priests would never have held a trial on Passover. Religious law prohibits work of any kind on the Sabbath. On the other hand, there are Jewish documents which describe the priests turning in fellow Jews to the Romans on other occasions.
Is it possible that the Roman leadership alone would have arrested him and executed him?
It is clear that he was executed on the order of Roman authority, because crucifixion was a punishment inflicted only by the Romans. And it's possible that it was only Roman authority involved, but I and the majority of contemporary scholars, including Jewish scholars, would say that most likely a very narrow circle of the Jewish ruling elite centered in the temple, whose responsibility was domestic peace, if you will, were involved as collaborators with the Roman governor.
In every version of the story, the Jewish leaders take Jesus to the Roman military governor, Pontius Pilate, and have to pressure him before he will pass the sentence. Many historians don't believe it.
The conventional Christian wisdom, I think that's the way to put it, say that the Jews put him on trial and forced Pontius Pilate to crucify him.
The conventional Christian wisdom usually forgets the situation. Pilate is running the country.
We have evidence other than the Gospels for Pilate. Josephus talks about him as a thug, a really, in a string of bad governors, he was one of the worst. Philo of Alexandria, who's Jesus' contemporary, writes that Pilate was known for his theft, his venality, and his execution of untried prisoners. Jesus fits into that category without effort.
The only element of the crucifixion story confirmed by a source outside the Gospels, by the Roman historian Tacitus, is this: it is Pilate who finally condemns Jesus.
I think what Pilate's actually doing is addressing Jesus' followers. This is a very, very effective way of saying, calm down, guys. The kingdom of God isn't coming this Passover. Because people would have gone to bed all excited about the approach of the kingdom and Jesus' authority to announce it. And when they woke up the next morning, Jesus would have been, on his way to the cross.
Well, maybe. But the stark truth is we don't know if more than a handful of people paid much attention to Jesus' execution. There are scholars who believe that Jesus didn't generate very much enthusiasm in Jerusalem.
I think that the Romans executed him probably summarily without a trial at all, just because he was a public nuisance.
So do you therefore believe that in his time, in his day, in that place, he was a rather minor character?
Yes.
You do?
Mm-hmm.
By your definition, then, Jesus is not an heroic figure at all until he gets into the hands of all the people who are going to write and embellish about him afterwards.
No, I don't think that's correct.
Okay.
See, I think he was an heroic figure. Jesus was heroic in the sense that he died for the integrity of his vision. He was unwilling to compromise. It never occurred to him to look out for himself. He didn't ask anything for himself, so far as we can tell. He didn't even ask his followers to do anything in particular. That's a heroic figure.